What if I told you the perfect happy polygamous family was secretly falling apart from episode 1 and nobody noticed until it was too late? Stay till the end because the final truth about the Brown family changes everything. And if you love shocking reality TV breakdowns, hit subscribe right now because this channel exposes the drama everybody else misses. Back when reality television was obsessed with presenting unusual families as heartwarming social experiments, the Brown family arrived on screen looking like they had unlocked some kind of secret formula for happiness. They smiled constantly, they joked together, they finished each other's sentences, and they insisted over and over that their version of plural marriage was built entirely on love, respect, and faith. But even as of very first moments, something about the entire situation felt strangely fragile, like one wrong move could crack the entire foundation beneath them. And once you start paying attention to the details, it becomes impossible to ignore the tension hiding underneath the polished introductions. Because while Kody Brown proudly introduced his 3 wives, Meri, Janelle, and Christine, as equal partners in one giant happy family, the emotional imbalance between them was already impossible to hide. No matter how hard the show tried to frame it as wholesome, unconventional fun, Kody stood at the center of everything, grinning like a man convinced he had discovered a cheat code for life, while the women around him quietly carried the emotional labor of raising children, managing households, and suppressing their own insecurities in order to keep the peace. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that many viewers, including the narrator, originally wanted to believe them. Because at first glance, the Browns looked different, but not necessarily dangerous. They presented themselves as misunderstood outsiders, unfairly judged by society. And in an era where people were increasingly encouraged to celebrate alternative lifestyles, it felt easy to shrug and say, hey, if these adults are happy, then who are we to question it? But hindsight changes everything. Because rewatching the first episode now feels less like meeting a joyful family and more like witnessing the opening scene of a slow-moving emotional disaster that nobody involved fully understood yet. The Browns claimed their lifestyle created more love, more support, and more freedom for everyone involved. But almost immediately, contradictions started slipping through the cracks. Christine, who was presented as bubbly, energetic, and deep, all hinted at a hidden hierarchy operating beneath the surface, despite the family's insistence that no such hierarchy existed. And once viewers began learning more about fundamentalist Mormon culture, those dynamics became even more unsettling. Because within many plural marriage communities, the position of each wife absolutely matters. The first wife often holds seniority. Newer wives can dramatically shift the emotional balance, and favoritism can quietly dominate the entire family structure, no matter how strongly everyone pretends otherwise. And perhaps no storyline exposed that reality more than the looming arrival of Robyn. Even before she physically appeared on screen, her presence hovered over the family like an approaching storm. The adults framed her introduction as an exciting expansion of love, but the nervous energy surrounding the conversations told a different story. Because adding another wife did not just mean another relationship, it meant redistributing already limited attention, affection, time, and resources across an even larger group. And while the adults smiled through the announcement, the children looked confused, uncertain, and slightly overwhelmed, especially the older kids who already understood how stretched thin their father really was. And yet Kody seemed almost euphoric about the idea of bringing Robyn into the family, as though he were chasing the thrill of a new beginning, without fully considering the emotional consequences for the people already depending on him. And that became one of the defining patterns of the series. Kody consistently appeared more energized by expansion, novelty, and performance than by the difficult emotional maintenance required to keep long-term relationships healthy. Because maintaining one marriage takes communication, accountability, and emotional consistency. Maintaining 4 marriages while raising a massive family requires even more of those qualities. And over time, viewers began realizing that Kody often preferred grand speeches about love over the exhausting reality of showing up consistently for the people around him. Meanwhile, the wives adapted in very different ways. Janelle buried herself in work, Christine buried herself in caregiving, and Meri buried herself in attempts to preserve a connection that seemed to fade more every year. But perhaps the most heartbreaking victims of the entire system were the children, Because while the show portrayed the giant family as chaotic but loving, there were constant signs that the older kids carried responsibilities far beyond what children should have to manage. Logan especially stood out almost immediately as a second parent, rather than simply a teenage son. Waking up early, cooking breakfast, organizing younger siblings, and helping maintain order while the adults treated his
defending the lifestyle and reassuring viewers that everyone involved was genuinely happy. And perhaps that constant need for reassurance became the biggest red flag of all. Because truly healthy relationships rarely require endless public justification. But the Browns seemed trapped in a cycle of convincing both themselves and the audience that plural marriage was not only functional, but somehow superior to traditional relationships, even as emotional exhaustion leaked through the cracks in subtle, heartbreaking ways. Christine nervously joked about bizarre fears and routines that hinted at overwhelming anxiety. Janelle admitted she preferred staying busy outside the home rather than engaging with domestic chaos. And Mary quietly revealed the devastation of infertility in a culture where motherhood defined female success. Meanwhile, Cody floated through the center of it all, talking endlessly about love and unity, while appearing strangely disconnected from the emotional burdens weighing down each of his wives. And that disconnect became impossible to ignore once viewers revisited the show knowing how the story eventually ends. Because suddenly, every interaction feels loaded with foreshadowing. Every joke sounds sharper, every awkward silence lasts longer, and every attempt to sell the audience on perfect plural marriage feels tinged with sadness. Because underneath the cheerful music and family dinners was a group of people already struggling to maintain an illusion they desperately needed to believe themselves. And maybe that is what makes the Sister Wives story so compelling years later. It was never really about whether plural marriage could work. It became a real-time study of what happens when people spend years sacrificing emotional honesty in order to preserve an image. And by the time the cracks finally widened into full collapse, the warning signs had been visible all along, hidden inside nervous smiles, rehearsed speeches, and carefully controlled family moments that looked wholesome on the surface, but carried a very different truth underneath. As the first episode continued, the illusion of the perfect plural family became even harder to believe, because every cheerful explanation about the benefits of their lifestyle accidentally exposed another emotional cost hiding underneath the surface. Cody wanted viewers to see him as a devoted husband, balancing multiple loving relationships with ease. But the reality looked far less stable. Because no matter how often he repeated the phrase, "love should be multiplied, not divided," the emotional math simply did not add up. One man was trying to split his attention between 3 wives, more than a dozen children, and an entirely new relationship with Robin, while still convincing everyone around him that nobody was being neglected. And perhaps the most revealing detail was how normalized loneliness had become inside the family. The wives casually spoke about only seeing their husband every few nights, as if emotional distance was some kind of romantic advantage, rather than a glaring warning sign. Christine even tried to frame the arrangement as freedom, saying that sharing a husband gave her extra time for herself. But viewers quickly realized that supposed freedom mostly meant spending long stretches functioning like a single parent, while Cody moved between homes like a visitor, instead of a constant supportive partner. And the more the wives explained the perks of plural marriage, the more their words sounded like coping mechanisms, carefully developed over years of emotional compromise. Janelle proudly described how much she loved working outside the home, while Christine handled the majority of the child rearing. But underneath that arrangement was a deeply unequal system, where one woman escaped into endless work, while another quietly sacrificed her entire identity to keep the household running. And perhaps the saddest part is that Christine genuinely seemed to believe this sacrifice made her valuable, because she had spent her whole life inside a culture teaching women that service, suffering, and self-denial were signs of righteousness. So she smiled while carrying overwhelming responsibility. She laughed while raising children who were not biologically hers. While pregnant, exhausted, and overwhelmed,
And perhaps that is why so many viewers later identified Robin's arrival as the true turning point in the series. Because even though the emotional cracks existed long before she appeared, her entrance exposed them in ways nobody could ignore anymore. Cody became visibly more invested in his relationship with Robin, more attentive, more emotionally engaged, and more willing to prioritize her needs over everyone else's. And once that favoritism became obvious, the fragile balance holding the family together started collapsing rapidly. Because plural marriage only functions when everyone involved at least believes they are valued equally. And the moment one relationship begins receiving significantly more attention, resentment becomes inevitable. Yet even as those resentments quietly grew, the family continued performing happiness for the cameras, repeating phrases about unity, faith, and love, while avoiding the deeper conversations that might have forced them to confront reality. And that pattern of emotional avoidance became one of the defining characteristics of the Brown family story. Every uncomfortable truth was softened, every conflict was reframed, and every painful moment was buried beneath rehearsed optimism. Because admitting how unhappy they truly were would have threatened not only their relationships, but their entire belief system. After all, these women had built their identities around the idea that plural marriage was spiritually meaningful, emotionally fulfilling, and morally right. So questioning the structure itself would mean questioning years of sacrifice, devotion, and suffering. And that kind of realization can be terrifying, especially when cameras are documenting your life in front of millions of people. Meanwhile, the children continued adapting to the chaos around them with a level of maturity that often felt heartbreaking. Logan remained trapped in the role of unofficial third parent, waking up early, managing siblings, and carrying responsibilities no teenager should have to shoulder, while the adults praised him for being reliable without fully acknowledging why he needed to be so reliable in the first place. And he was not alone. Many of the older Brown children grew up quickly because large families operating under emotional strain often rely heavily on older siblings to maintain stability. And while the show framed this dynamic as teamwork,
And that is why rewatching Sister Wives feels less like reality TV and more like watching a family slowly unravel in real time. If you want more shocking breakdowns and hidden drama from your favorite shows, hit subscribe right now because the next recap is even crazier and you do not want to miss it.